The Bone Doll's Twin by Lynn Foiling. Read by a devoted fan. Part 1. Document fragment discovered in the east tower of the Oreska house. An old man looks back at me from my mirror now. Even among the other wizards here in Rimini, I am a relic of forgotten times. My new apprentice, little Lysander, cannot imagine what it was like to be a free wizard of the second Oreska. At Lysander's birth, this beautiful city had already stood for 2 centuries above her deep harbour. Yet to me, it shall always and forever be the new capital. In the days of my youth, a horse cast-off like Lysander would have gone unschooled. If he were lucky, he might have ended up a village weathercaller or soothsayer. More likely, he would have unwittingly killed someone and been stoned as a witch. Only the Light-Bearer knows how many God-touched children were lost before the advent of the third Oreska. Before this city was built, before this great house of learning was gifted to us by its great founder, we wizards of the second Oreska made our own way and lived by our own laws. Now, in return for service to the crown, we have this house, with its libraries, archives, and its common history. I am the only one still living who knows how dear a price was paid for that. 2 centuries, 3 or 4 lifetimes for most people, a mere season for those of us touched by the Light-Bearer's gift. We wizards stand apart, Arcanum, my own teacher Aya told me when I was scarcely older than Lysander is now. We are stones in the river's course, watching the rush of life whirl past. Standing by Lysander's door tonight, watching the lad sleep, I imagined Aya's ghost beside me, and for a moment it seemed as if it was my younger self I gazed at, a plain, shy nobleman's son who'd shown a talent for animal charming. While guesting at my father's estate, Aya had recognized the magic in me and revealed it to my family. I wept the day I left home with her. How easy it would be to call those tears foreshadowing, that device that playwrights are so enamoured of these days. But I have never quite believed in fate, despite all the prophecies and oracles that shaped my life. There's always a choice in there somewhere. I've seen too often how many people make their own future through the balance of each day's little kindnesses and cruelties. I chose to go with Aya. Later I chose to believe in the visions the oracle granted to her and to me. By my own choice I helped rekindle the power of this good, strong country, and so may rightly claim to have helped the fair white towers of Rimini rise against this blue western sky. But on those few nights when I sleep deeply, what do I dream of? An infant's cry cut short. You might think after so many years that it would be easier to accept, that one necessary act of cruelty could alter the course of history like an earthquake shifts a river's course. But that deed, that cry, lies at the heart of all the good that came after, like a grain of sand at the heart of a pearl's glowing nacre. I alone carry the memory of that infant's brief wail all those years ago. I alone know the filth at the heart of this poem. Chapter 1. Aya pulled off her straw wayfarer's hat and fanned herself with it as her horse laboured up the rocky trail towards Afra. The sun stood at noon, blazing against the cloudless blue. It was only the first week of Gorathin, far too early for it to be this hot. It seemed the drought was going to last another season. Snow still glistened on the peaks overhead, however. Now and then a plume of wind-blown white gusted out against the stark blue of the sky, creating the tantalizing illusion of coolness, while down here in the narrow pass no breeze stirred. Anywhere else Aya might have conjured up a bit of wind, but no magic was allowed within a day's ride of Afra. The young wizard's linen tunic was sweated through down the back, and stained drab with a week's worth of road dust. He never complained. His only concession to the heat was the sacrifice of a patchy beard he'd cultivated since he turned 21 last Erasin. Poor boy, Aya thought fondly. The newly shaven skin was already badly sunburnt. Their destination, the oracle at Afra, lay at the very heart of Scala's mountainous spine, and was a gruelling ride any time of year. Aya had made the long pilgrimage twice before, but never in the summer. The walls of the pass pressed close to the trail here, and centuries of seeker had left their names and supplications to Eleanor Lightbearer scratched in the dark stone. Some had simply scratched the god's thin crescent moon. These lined the trail like countless tilting smiles. Arknell had left one of his own very earlier that morning to commemorate his first visit. Aya's horse stumbled, and the reason for their journey bumped hard against her thigh. Inside the worn leather bag slung from her saddle horn, smothered in elaborate wrappings and magic, was a lopsided bowl crudely fashioned of burnt clay. There was nothing remarkable about it, except for the fierce aura of malevolence it gave off when not hidden away. More than once over the years she'd imagined throwing it over a cliff or into a river. In reality, she could no more have done that than cut off her own arm. She was the guardian. The contents of that bag had been her charge for over a century. Unless the oracle can tell me otherwise. Fixing her thin, greying hair into a knot on top of her head, she found again her sweaty neck. Arknell turned in the saddle and regarded her with concern. His unruly black curls dripped sweat beneath the wilted brim of his hat. "You're red in the face. We should stop and rest again." "No, we're nearly there." "Then have some more water at least, and put your hat back on. You make me feel old. I'm only 230, you know." 232, he corrected with a wry grin. It was an old game between them. She made a sour face at him. "Just wait until you're in your third age, my boy. It gets harder to keep track." The truth was, hard riding did tire her more than it had back in her early hundreds, although she wasn't about to admit it. She took a long pull from her waterskin and flexed her shoulders. "You've been quiet today. Do you have a query yet?" "I think so. I hope the oracle finds it worthy." Such earnestness made Aya smile. This journey was merely another lesson as far as Arknell knew. She told him nothing of her true quest. The leather bag bumped against her thigh like a nagging child. "Forgive me, Asgar," she thought, knowing her long-dead teacher, the first guardian, would not have approved. The last stretch of the trail was the most treacherous. The rock face to their right gave way to a chasm, and in places they rode with their left knees brushing the cliff face. Arknell disappeared around the sharp bend and then called back, "I can see Eleanor's keyhole, just as you described." Rounding the outcropping, Aya saw a painted archway glowing like a garnished apparition where it straddled the trail. Stylized dragons glowed in red, blue, and gold around the narrow opening, which was just wide enough for a single horseman to pass through. Afre lay less than a mile beyond. Sweat stung Aya's eyes, making her blink. It had been snowing the first time Asgar had brought her here. Aya had come later than most to the wizardly arts. She'd grown up on a tenant farm on the border of Scala's mainland territory. The closest market town lay across the Keeley River in Messina, and it was here that Aya's family traded. Like many bordermen, her father had taken a Messenian wife, and made his offerings to Delana the Maker rather than Ilinor or Sakor. So it was, when she first showed signs of magic, that she was sent back across the river to study with an old Delanan priest who tried to make her a Drysen healer of her. She soon earned praise for her herb craft, but as soon as the ignorant old fellow discovered that she could make fire with a thought, he bound a witch charm to her wrist and sent her home in disgrace. With this taint on her, she found little welcome in her village, and no prospect of a husband. She was a spinster of 24 when Asgar happened to cross her in a market square. He told her later that it was the witch charm that had caught his eye as she stood haggling with a trader over the price of her goats. She'd taken no notice of him, thinking he was just another old soldier finding his way home from the wars. Asgar had been as ragged and hollow-cheeked as any of them, and the left sleeve of his tunic hung empty. Aya was forced to take a second look, when he walked up to her, clasped her hand, and broke into a sweet smile of recognition. After a brief conversation, she sold off her goats and followed the old wizard down the south road without a backward glance. All anyone would have found of her, had they bothered to search, was the witch charm lying in the weeds by the market gate. Asgar hadn't scoffed at her fire-making. Instead, he'd explained that it was the first sign that she was one of the god-touched of Ilinor. Then he taught her to harness the unknown power she possessed into potent magic of the Oreska wizards. Asgar was a free wizard, beholden to no one. Eschewing the comforts of a single patron, He wandered as he liked, finding welcome in noble houses and humble ones alike. Together he and Aya travelled the three lands and beyond, sailing west to Orion, where even the common folk were as long-lived as wizards and possessed magic. Here she learned that Orenferi were the first Oreska. It was their blood mingled with that of Aya's race that had given magic to the chosen ones of Scala and Pelenmar. This gift came with a price. Human wizards could neither bear nor sire children, but Aya considered herself well repaid both in magic and later with students as gifted and companionable as Arcanum. Asgard had also taught her more about the Great War than any of her father's ballads or legends, for he had been among the wizards who fought for Scala under Queen Gerlen's banner. "There's never been another such war as that, and pray Sakor there never shall be again," he said, staring into the campfire at night, as if he saw his fallen comrades there. For one shining span of time, wizards stood shoulder to shoulder with warriors, battling the black necromancers of Pelenmar. The tales Asgard told of those days gave Aya nightmares. A necromancer's demon, a Dragomonnes, he called it, had torn off his left arm. Gruesome as these tales were, Aya still clung to them, for only there had Asgard given her any glimpse of where the strange bowl had come from. Asgard had carried it then. Never in all the years she had known him had he ever let it out of his possession. "Spoils of war," he said, with a dark laugh, the first time he had opened the bag to show her. But beyond that he would tell her nothing, except that the bowl could not be destroyed, and that existence could not be revealed to anyone but the next guardian. Instead, he schooled her rigorously in the complex web of spells that protected it, making her weave and unweave them until she could do it in the blink of an eye. "You'll be the guardian after me," he reminded her when she grew impatient with the secrecy. "Then you'll understand. Be certain you choose your successor wisely." "But how would I know who to choose?" He smiled, taking her hand as he had when the first they had met in the marketplace. "Trust in the light-bearer. You'll know." And she had. At first she couldn't help pressing to know more about it. Where had he found it? Who had made it, and why? For Asgard had remained obdurate. "Not until the time comes for you to take on the full care of it. Then I will tell you all there is to know." Sadly, that day had taken them both unawares. Asgard had dropped dead in the streets of Uro, one fine spring day, soon after the 1st century. One moment he was holding forth on the beauty of a new transformation spell he'd just created. The next he slipped to the ground with a hand pressed to his chest and a look of mild surprise in his fixed dead eyes. Scarcely in her second age, Aya suddenly found herself guardian without knowing what she guarded or why. She kept the oath she'd sworn to him and waited for Eleanor to reveal her successor. She'd waited 2 lifetimes, as promising students came and went, and said nothing to them of the bag and its secrets. But as Asgard had promised, she'd recognized Arcanor the first moment she had spied him playing in his father's orchard 15 years earlier. He could already keep a pippin spinning in mid-air, and could put out a candle flame without a thought. Young as he was, she taught him what little she knew of the bowl as soon as he was bound over to her. Later, when he was strong enough, she taught him how to weave the protections. Even so, she kept the burden of it on her own shoulders, as Asgard had instructed. Over the years, Aya had come to regard the bowl as little more than a sacred nuisance, but that had all changed a month ago when the wretched thing had taken over her dreams. These ghastly interwoven nightmares, more vivid than any she had ever known, had finally driven her here, for she saw the bowl and all of them, carried high above a battlefield by a monstrous black figure for which she knew no name. "Aya! Aya! Are you well?" Aya shook off the revere that had claimed her and gave him a reassuring smile. "Ah, we are here at last, I see." Pinched in a deep cleft of rock, Afra was scarcely large enough to be called a village, and existed solely to serve the oracle and the pilgrims who journeyed here. A wayfarer's inn and the chambers of the priest were carved like bank swallow nests into the cliff face on either side of the small paved square. Their doorways and deep-set windows were framed with carved fretwork and pillars of ancient design. The square was deserted now, but a few people waved to them from the shadowy windows. At the centre of the square stood a red jasper stele, as tall as Arcanor. A spring bubbled up at its base and flowed away into a stone basin and on to the trough beyond. "By the light!" Arcanor exclaimed. Dismounting, he turned his horse loose at the trough and went to examine the stele. Running his palm over the inscription carved in 4 languages, he read the words that had changed the course of Scalan history 3 centuries earlier. So long as the daughter of Themistocles' line defends and rules, Scala shall never be subjugated. He shook his head in wonder. This is the original, isn't it? Aya nodded sadly. Queen Geraldine placed this here herself as a thank offering right after the war. The Oracle's Queen, they called her then. In the darkest days of the war, when it seemed that Pelimar would devour the lands of her neighbours, Scala and Messina, the Scalan king Themistocles had left the battlefields and journeyed here to consult the oracle. When he returned to battle, he brought with him his daughter Geraldine, then a maiden of 16. Obeying the oracle's words, he anointed her before his aghast army, and passed his crown and sword to her. According to Asgar, the generals had not thought much of the king's decision, yet from the start the girl proved God-touched as a warrior, and led the allies to victory in a year's time, killing the Pelimarian overlords single-handedly at the Battle of Isle. She'd been a fine queen in peace as well, and ruled for over 50 years. Asgar had been among her mourners. "These markers used to stand all over Scala, didn't they?" asked Arcanor. "Yes, at every major crossroad in the land. You were just a babe when King Eris tore them all down." Aya dismounted and touched the stone reverently. It was hot under her palm, and still as smooth as the day it left the stone-cutter's shop. Even Eris didn't dare touch this one. Why not? When he sent word for it to be removed, the priest refused. To force the issue meant invading Aphra itself, the most sacred ground in Scala, so Eris graciously relented and contented himself with having all others dumped into the sea. There was also a golden tablet bearing the inscription in the throne room at the old palace. I wonder what happened to that. But the young wizard had more immediate concerns. Shading his eyes, he studied the cliff face. "Where's the oracle's shrine?" "Further up the valley. Drink deeply here. We must walk the rest of the way." Leaving their mounts at the inn, they followed a well-worn path deeper into the deep cleft. The way became steeper and more difficult as they went. No trees to shade them, no moisture to lay the white dust that hung on the hot midday air. Soon the way dwindled to a faint track winding up between boulders and over rock faces worn smooth and treacherous by centuries of pilgrims' feet. They met 2 other groups of seekers coming in the opposite direction. A knot of young soldiers were laughing and talking bravely, all but one young man who hung back from his fellows with the fear of death clear in his eyes. The second group clustered around an elderly merchant woman who wept silently as the younger members of her party helped her down the treacherous path. Arcanor eyed them nervously. Aya waited until the merchant party had disappeared around the bend, then sat down on the rock to rest. The way here was hardly wide enough for 2 people to pass, and held the heat like an oven. She took a sip from the skin Arcanor had filled at the spring. The water was still cold enough to make her eyes ache. "Is it much further?" he asked. "Just a little way." Promising herself a cool bath at the inn, Aya stood and continued on. "You knew the king's mother, didn't you?" Arcanor said, scrambling along behind her. "Was she as bad as they say?" The stele must have got him in thinking. "Not at first. Engelaine the Just, they called her. But she had a dark streak in her that worsened with age. Some say it came from her father's blood. Others said it was because of the trouble she'd had with childbearing. Her first consort gave her 2 sons. Then she seemed to go barren for years, and gradually developed a taste for younger consorts and public executions. Eris's own father went to the block for treason. After that, no one was safe. By the fall, I can still remember the stink of the crow cages lining the roads around Euro. We all hoped she'd improved when she finally had a daughter, but she didn't. It only made her worse. It had been easy enough in those black days for Angelina's eldest son, Prince Eris, already a seasoned warrior and the people's darling, to argue that the oracle's words had been twisted, that the prophecy had referred only to King Themistocles' actual daughter, not to a matriarchal line of succession. Surely brave Prince Eris was better suited to the throne than the only direct female heir. His half-sister Ariane was just past her 3rd birthday. Never mind the fact that Scala had enjoyed unparalleled prosperity under her queens. All that the only other man to take the throne, Jolin's own son Pelles, had brought on both plague and drought during his brief reign. Only when his sister had replaced him on the throne had Eleanor protected the land again, as the oracle had promised. Until now. When Angelina died so suddenly, it was whispered that Prince Eris and his brother Aron had had a hand in it, but the rumour had been whispered with relief rather than condemnation. Everyone knew Eris had ruled in all but name during the last terrible years of his mother's decline. The renewed rumblings from Pellamar were growing too loud for the nobles to risk civil war on behalf of a child queen. The crown passed to Eris without challenge. Pellamar attacked the southern ports that same year, and he drove the invaders back into the sea and burned their black ships. This seemed to lay the prophecy to rest. All the same, there had been more blights and droughts in the past 19 years than even the oldest wizards could recall. The current drought was in its third year in some parts of the country, and had wiped out whole villages already decimated by wildfires and waves of plague brought in from the northern trade routes. Arcanor's parents had died in one such epidemic a few years earlier. A quarter of Aero's population had succumbed in a few months' time, including Prince Aron, as well as Eris's consort, both daughters, and 2 of his 3 sons, leaving only the second youngest boy, Corin, alive. Since then, the words of the oracle were whispered again in certain quarters. Aya had her own reasons now for regretting Eris's coup. His sister, Ariane, had grown up to marry Aya's patron, powerful Duke Rhys of Aeton. The couple were expecting their first child in the fall. Both wizards were sweating and winded by the time they reached the tight cul-de-sac where the shrine lay. "It's not quite what I expected," Arcanor muttered, eyeing what appeared to be a broad stone wall. Aya chuckled. "Don't judge too quickly." 2 sturdy priests in dusty red robes and silver masks sat in the shade of a wooden lean-to beside the well. Aya joined them and sat down heavily on a stone seat. "I need time to compose my thoughts," she told Arcanor. "You go first." The priest carried a coil of heavy rope to the well, motioning for Arcanor to join them. He gave Aya a nervous grin as they fixed the loop around his hips. Still silent, they guided him into the stone enclosure to the entrance to the oracle's chamber. From the surface this was nothing but a hole in the ground, about 4 feet in diameter. It was always daunting, this act of faith and surrender, and more so the first time. But as always, Arcanor did not hesitate. Sitting with his feet over the edge, he gripped the rope and nodded for the priest to let him down. He slid out of sight, and they paid out the line until it went slack. Aya remained in the lean-to, trying to still her racing heart. She'd done her best for days not to think too directly on what she was about to do. Now that she was here, she suddenly regretted her decision. Closing her eyes, she tried to examine this fear, but could find no basis for it. Yes, she was disobeying her master's injunction, but that wasn't it. Here on the very doorstep of the oracle, she had a premonition of something dark looming just ahead. She prayed silently for the strength to face whatever Eleanor revealed to her today, for she could not turn aside. Arcanor's twitch on the rope came sooner than she expected. The priest hauled him up, and he hurried over and collapsed on the ground beside her, looking rather perplexed. "Aya, it was the strangest thing," he began, but she held up a warning hand. "There'll be time enough later," she told him, knowing she must go now or not at all. She took her place in the harness, breath tight in her chest as she hung her feet over the edge of the hole. Grasping the rope with one hand and the leather bag with another, she nodded to the priest and began her descent. She felt the familiar nervous flutter in her belly as she swung down into the cool darkness. She'd never been able to guess the actual dimensions of this underground chamber. The silence and faint movement of the air against her face suggested a vast cavern. Where the sunlight struck the stone floor below, it showed the gently undulating smoothness of the stone worn by some ancient underground river. After a few moments her feet touched solid ground, and she stepped free of the rope and out of the circle of sunlight. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could make out a faint glow nearby and walked towards it. The light had appeared from a different direction each time she'd come here. When she reached the oracle at last, however, everything was just as she remembered. A crystal orb on the swivel tripod gave off a wide circle of light, The oracle sat next to it on a low ivory stool carved into the shape of a crouching dragon. This one is so young, I thought, inexplicably saddened. The last two oracles had been old women with skin bleached white by years of darkness. This girl was no more than 14, but her skin was already pale. Dressed in a simple linen shift that left her arms and feet bare, she sat with her palms on her knees. Her face was round and plain, and her eyes vacant. Like wizards, the Sibyls of Aphra did not escape Eleanor's touch unscathed. Aya knelt at her feet. A masked priest stepped into the circle of light with a large silver salver held out before him. The silence of the chamber swallowed Aya's sigh as she unwrapped the bowl and placed it on the salver. The priest presented it to the oracle, placing it on her knees. Her face remained vacant, betraying nothing. Doesn't she feel the evil of the thing? Aya wondered. The unveiled power of it made Aya's head hurt. The girl stirred at last and looked down at the bowl. Silvery light, bright as moonshine on snow, swelled in a nimbus around her head and shoulders. Aya felt a thrill of awe. Eleanor had entered the girl. I see demons feasting on the dead. I see the god whose name is not spoken, the oracle said softly. Aya's head turned to the stone in her breast. Her worst fears confirmed. This was Zemarius, the dark god of necromancy, worshipped by the Pelamarians, who'd come too close to destroying Scala in the Great War. I've dreamt this. War and disasters far worse than any Scala has ever known. You see too far, wizard. The oracle lifted the bowl in both hands, and by some trick of the light her eyes became sunken black holes in her face. The priest was nowhere to be seen now, although Aya had not heard him leave. The oracle turned the bowl slowly in her hands. Black makes white, foul makes pure, evil creates greatness. Out of Pelamar comes present salvation and future peril. This is a seed that must be watered with blood, but you see too far. The oracle tilted the bowl forward. Bright blood splashed out, too much for such a small vessel. It formed a round pool on the stone floor at the oracle's feet. Looking into it, Aya caught the reflection of a woman's face framed by the visor of a bloody war helm. Aya could make out two intense blue eyes, a firm mouth above a pointed chin. The face was harsh one moment, sorrowful the next, and so familiar that it made her heart ache, though she couldn't say then of whom those eyes reminded her. Flames reflected off the helm, and somewhere in the distance Aya heard the clash of battle. The apparition slowly faded and was replaced by that of a shining white palace standing on a high cliff. It had a glittering dome, and at each of its four corners stood a slender tower. "Behold the third Oresca," the oracle whispered. "Here may you lay your burden down." Aya leaned forward with a gasp of awe. The palace had hundreds of windows, and at every window stood a wizard looking directly at her. In the highest window of the closest tower she saw Arcanel, robed in blue and holding the bowl in his hands. A little child with thick blonde curls stood at his side. She could see Arcanel quite clearly now, even though she was so far away. He was an old man, with a face deeply lined and weary beyond words. Even so, her heart swelled with joy at the sight of him. "Ask," the oracle whispered. "What is the bowl?" she called to Arcanel. "It is not for us, but he will know," Arcanel told her, passing the bowl to the little boy. The child looked at Aya with an old man's eyes and smiled. "All is woven together, guardian," the oracle said as this vision failed into something darker. "This is the legacy you and your kind are offered. One with the true queen, one with Scala, you shall be tested with fire." Aya saw the symbol of her craft, the thin crescent of Eleanor's moon, against a circle of fire and the number 222 glowing just beneath it, in figures of white flames so bright they hurt her. Then Ero lay spread before her under a bloated moon, and flames from harbour to citadel, an army under the flag of Pelamar surrounding it, too numerous to count. Aya could feel the heat of the flames on her face as Eros led his army out against them, but his soldiers fell dead behind him, and the flesh fell from his charger's bones in shreds. The Pelamarians surrounded the king like wolves, and he was lost from sight. The vision shifted sizzingly again, and Aya saw the scarlet crown bent and tarnished now, lying in a barren field. So long as a daughter of the mottless line defends and rules, Skala shall never be subjugated, the oracle whispered. Ariane? Aya asked, but knew, even as she spoke, that it had not been the princess's face she had seen framed in that helm. The oracle began to sway and keen. Raising the bowl, she poured its endless flow over her head like a libation, masking herself in blood. Falling to her knees, she grasped Aya's hand, and a whirlwind took them, striking Aya blind. Screaming winds surrounded her, then entered the top of her head and plunged down through the core of her like a shipwright's auger. Images flashed by like wind-borne leaves, the strange number on its shields, the helmeted woman in many forms and guises, old, young, in rags, crowned, hanging naked from a gibbet, riding garland through a broad, unfamiliar streets. I saw her clearly now, her face, her blue eyes, black hair, and long limbs like Ariane's, but it was not the princess. The oracle's voice cut through the maelstrom. This is your queen, wizard. This true daughter of Thermopolis. She will turn her face to the west. Suddenly Aya felt a bundle placed in her arms and looked down at the dead infant the oracle had given her. Others see, but only through smoke and darkness, said the oracle. By the will of Eleanor the bowl came into your hands. It is the long burden of your line, guardian, and the bitterest of all. But in this generation comes the child who is the foundation of what is to come. She is your legacy. 2 children, 1 queen, marked with the blood of passage. The dead infant looked up at Aya with black, staring eyes, and searing pain tore through her chest. She knew whose child this was. Then the vision was gone, and Aya found herself kneeling in front of the oracle, with an unopened bag in her arms. There was no dead infant, no blood on the floor. The oracle sat on her stool, shift and hair unstained. 2 children, 1 queen, the oracle whispered, looking at Aya with shining white eyes of Eleanor. Aya trembled before the gaze, trying to cling to all she had seen and heard. The others who dream of this child, honoured one, do they mean her well or ill? Will they help me raise her? But the god was gone, and the child slumped on the stool, had no answers. Sunlight blinded Aya as she emerged from the cavern. The heat took her breath away, and her legs would not support her. Arcanor caught her as she collapsed against the stone enclosure. Aya, what happened? What's wrong? Just give me a moment, she croaked, clutching the bag to her chest. A seed watered with blood. Arcanor lifted her easily and carried her into the shade. He pulled the water skin to her lips, and Aya drank, leaning heavily against him. It was some time before she felt strong enough to start back for the inn. Arcanor kept one arm about her waist, and she suffered his help without complaint. They were within sight of the Stele when she fainted. When she opened her eyes again, she was lying on a soft bed in a cool, dim room at the inn. Sunlight streamed in through a crack in the dusty shutter, and struck shadows across the carved wall beside the bed. Arcanor sat beside her, clearly worried. "What happened with the oracle?" he asked. Eleanor spoke, and my questions were answered, she thought bitterly. How I wish I'd listened to Asgard. She took his hand. Later, when I'm feeling stronger. Tell me your vision. Was your query answered? Her answer obviously frustrated him, but he knew better than to press her. I'm not sure, he said. I asked what sort of wizard I'd become, what my path would be. She showed me a vision in the air, but all I could make out was an image of me holding a young boy in my arms. Did he have blonde hair? She asked, thinking of the child with the beautiful white hair. No, it was black. To be honest, I was disappointed, coming all this way just for that. I must have done something wrong in the asking. Sometimes you must wait for the meaning to be revealed. Aya turned away from that earnest young face, wishing that the light-bearer had granted her such a respite. The sun still blazed down on the square outside her window, but Aya saw only the road back to Aero before her, and the darkness at its end.